Welcome back, everybody. It's time for Chapter 5 of The Twits by Roald Dahl and illustrated by Quentin Blake. Are you ready, Harry? Okay. Chapter 5, The Glass Eye. You can play a lot of tricks with the glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in anytime you like. You can bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all the tricks with glass eyes. And one morning she took out her glass eye and dropped it into Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twit sat there drinking the beer slowly. The froth made white rings on the hairs around his mouth. He wiped the white froth onto his sleeve and wiped his sleeve on his trousers. "You're plotting something," Mr. Twit said. Mrs. Twit said, actually, "You're plotting something," keeping her back turned so he wouldn't see that she had taken out her glass eye. Whatever, this is Mrs. Twit talking. "Whenever you go all quiet like that, I know very well you're plotting something." Mrs. Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting away like mad. What does plotting mean, Harry? It means planning. You're thinking of doing something. He was trying to think up a really nasty trick that he could play on his wife that day. "You better be careful," Mrs. Twit said, "because when I see you starting to plot, I watch you like a wombat." "Oh, do shut up, you old hag," Mr. Twit said. He went on drinking his beer, and his evil mind kept working away on the latest horrid trick he was going to play on the old woman. Check him out plotting. Look at that. Can you do that face, Harry? Suddenly, as Mr. Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat, he caught sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eye staring up at him from the bottom of the mug. It made him jump. "I told you I was watching you," cackled Mrs. Twit. "I've got eyes everywhere, so you better be careful." Chapter 6, The Frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, don't you put a glass eye in my beer, Harry?
We don't have glass eyes.
You better not. Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pod, and he carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and he waited for the fun to begin. He's put a frog in her bed. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itchy. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Do you have an itchy tummy?
No.
Then all at once she felt something cold and slimy all around her feet. "Ah!" she screamed. "Well, what's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "There's something in my bed." "I bet it's that giant skilly wibbler I just saw on the floor right now," Mr. Twit said. "That what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. "It's got teeth like screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Save me! It's all over me feet." "It'll bite off your toes if you're not careful," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. "Oh." Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. What's he going to do with the water, Harry? He poured the water all over Mrs. Twit's face to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water, and it started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water, and this one was having a good time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. "This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night," she screamed again. "Ah! By golly, it is, giant skillywigger," Mr. Twit said. "It'll bite off your nose." And Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed, flew downstairs, and spent the night on the couch. And the frog went to sleep on a pillow. happy ending for the frog. Chapter 7, The Wormy Spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. What's she going to do with them?
Breakfast for them.
Oh no. She chose big long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. And at 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving!" cried Mr. Twit, poking it with his fork. It's a particularly disgusting scene. Oh, it's a new kind, Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long, tomato-covered worm strings around his fork and shoving them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squishy." "I find it very tasty," said Mrs. Twit. She was watching him from the other end, and it gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was so squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "Do you want to know why it had a bitter taste?" "Why?" "Because it was worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. Oh, we don't get to hear his reaction. We just move on to Chapter 8, The Funny Walking Stick. Are you ready? To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms and the spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his workshed. There, he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a coin, onto the bottom of her stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small, the next morning, Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. Harry is going to play the long game. These are where the best tricks come from. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood, and every night he crept downstairs and he added extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly, so perfectly that the extra bits looked like a part of the old stick. What's happening to a stick? He's putting bits on the bottom. What's happening to the stick? It's getting
longer.
That's right. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and
sillier.
Well, yeah, longer and longer, and silly. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it is almost impossible to know it's happening, like a flower. You, yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day, Harry. But you wouldn't think of it, would you? It's happening so slowly that you can't even notice it from one week to the next. And it was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick, Harry. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "What? So it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "Oh, there's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. Well, What can have happened? Mrs. Twit said, looking at her old walking stick. It must have suddenly grown longer. Oh, don't be a fool, Mr. Twit said. How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow. What on earth has happened? Cried Mrs. Twit. It's not the stick. It's you, said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. It's you that's getting shorter, and I've been noticing it for some time now. It's not true, said Mrs. Twit. You shrinking woman, said Mr. Twit. It's not possible. Oh, yes, it jolly well is, said Mr. Twit. You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days. Never, she cried. Oh, of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. You've got the dreaded shrinks. Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. Okay, that's enough for now, everybody. Soon we'll move on to Chapter 9. Mrs. Twit has the shrinks. See you next time, everybody.
I have 9.
You gonna wave goodbye, House?